Welcome to Code Catch Up. My name is Jamie Jones, and I want to do a quick video of a kind of a comparison of Ruby on Rails to Hanami. I've had some questions recently from people I know in meetup communities as well as actually on the YouTube channel. So I thought I want to answer these just via video instead of just chatting about it or typing something out in comments. So I just want to kind of get something out there that you can watch over or go back on and stuff like that. So what I've done is I've just written some notes down on my phone, and I'm just going to go over them and tell you what my experiences are like, what the differences are, and things like that. So first of all, just an overview. So Rails itself, so basically it's optimized for programmer happiness. That's their idea, convention over configuration. It's great, works really well, it's solid, it's tried and tested, it's a brilliant framework. Hanami is what their slogan here is saying is the web with simplicity, and it very much so is that. There's no bells and whistles, there's no magic, stuff like that. That's the core thing, is they try and get rid of magic, so everything's very much, you have to be more explicit with what you're including and how you're doing those things. So it's a little bit nicer that it's just not like some kind of parameters come in from nowhere. So I'll get into that in a little bit, but there's less kind of magic, or like what's happening, how's this got here, that kind of thing. So the core differences is basically structure-wise slash approach. So basically Rails has a configuration very much your standard MVC, whereas Hanami is MVC, but it's a touch different. So they like to split essentially the programming functionality or domains up. So essentially you can have, like by default, when you create a new Hanami application, you have a web kind of domain, and essentially from there you could have something else. So for example, you might have web being your actual website or web application as a whole, and then you might split out your admin section. So you might have a completely separate code base within that application, so that Hanami as a whole, but have that admin side split up, so you don't have to do all these conditionals everywhere. Everything's split out and nicely defined there. So you'll literally have another set of configuration for the actual application. So for admin side of things, you'll have different controllers, different models, etc. So it's very much split out to its own responsibilities and what it's doing. So another kind of application of that would be an API. So you'd have an API section to your application. So you're not kind of mixing things up into like really nested or deeply nested folder structures. You're very much splitting these things out. And by doing that, it also means you can then later on actually just duplicate the Hanami application, remove those other domains. So if we just want to have an API, and there you go, you've got your API out there. So very interesting take. It's something I want to dive into more, especially you may have seen this if you've been checking around other frameworks and things. So Elixir very much does this with umbrella applications, and recently Elixir's framework, basically Phoenix, that one 1.3 that's come out, does this very well, and it does it in the same way, but they call them contexts instead of domains. So that's a pretty big difference, and it's a different kind of approach in how you do things there, and that's probably the biggest change you'll probably see, besides being very explicit over things just happening implicitly in the background. Alright, so I'll get on to the next bits here. So I've got routing. So routing is basically the same. You still get your RESTful functionality, all that kind of stuff. You still do all your get, put, post, etc. Nothing new there. It's pretty much standard, and I don't think you'll find it too different in many other applications or software either. Testing, very much the same. You can specify mini test, you can specify RSpec, whatever you want. Testing is exactly the same. You might be just calling methods or controllers, etc. a bit different, but that's all there is there. Now controllers are interesting. So controllers in Rails very much, so you'll put all your RESTful actions in there, you know, your index, your new, etc. But with Hanami, you don't really have a controller. So it is a controller, but it isn't. They call them actions, and you're putting a single method in each of these actions. So you might have a create endpoint or a create controller in, a post controller in Rails, and then I might have a create method in there. In Hanami, you'll actually have like a create post controller, and from in there you'll have a call method, and it's just that single call method. So you're not having like def create, you're just having def call, and you'll pass in the parameters as a function argument. So the first argument is params, and that's basically meaning that you're actually passing the parameters in. And I like this approach simply because you can be very explicit in what you pass in when you're testing. So it makes the tests a lot quicker too, because you can really stub out what a param is. You don't actually have to make it a full parameter object, which you'd expect all the different little things on it. That's really nice. But that's very, very, very different there, and that's something you need to be aware of, because it is quite, you have to get a little bit used to it. It's quite different there. And along with those params, there's whitelisting of params. So you can think of it as kind of like strong parameters, but it goes a little bit further, because you can actually put your validation there on the controller. So it means per controller you can have different parameters. So yep, you can do that in Rails as well, but the actual validation side of things, that's where it gets different and interesting, because you can actually specify for that particular controller action, or that action, so to create, you might have different validation from when you're updating or things like that. So you can do that there. You can still do it in the model, but generally it's nicer to do it actually at the controller level, and you can catch things earlier, and it makes things a little bit more efficient. So it's nice to see there. That's the other one you have to be wary of. And the other thing is exposing instance variables. Now you can do instance variables in your controller action, but it won't go through to the view, and views is another thing we've got to talk about. But you actually have to explicitly expose, like actually say that this particular instance variable needs to be available to the view. So you could do it like @greeting is their example. But if you don't expose that in the view, you don't have access to greeting. It's gone. So you really need to be explicit about what you provide access to. So that's another one that's pretty important there. Now, as I was saying about views, now views aren't views as what you'd think in Hanami. So in Rails, we have templates, which is like the whole template as a whole, and then you have views, which are small little templates that go within that template. A little bit confusing there, but essentially you'd have a template for an action. So if you had a show action in Rails, you'd have a show view. Now with Hanami, you've got a view, and you also have templates. Now a template is actually, in Hanami, is actually a view in Rails. So this is a little bit strange if you're used to working with Rails, but basically your view that you'd use in Rails is now called a template. And then your view in Hanami is actually more like a decorator. So where you get some data in that needs to be rendered, and you can massage that data before it goes to actually be rendered. So you can think of it as it's forcing a decorator on you. You don't have to use it, but generally that's where you should, and you can do some logic there and then just have your actual markup and a little bit of code, maybe your conditionals like your loops, etc. Very, very simple. So it keeps the actual HTML and the markup, whatever you're doing, it could be JSON, I guess, that keeps it very, very simple, and it kind of forces you to not do a lot of logic or business logic in your actual presentation layout. So it's really nice to see there. The next thing I've got on this list, if I can go up and find it, models. So models is another big one that's very, very different. Like, they both have associations, you can do all that kind of stuff, that's great. But models are very, very unique, and they're split up into two domains. So they've got entities and repositories. So basically, repositories, they're an object that mediates between entities and the persistence layer. It offers a standardized API to query and execute commands on a database. Now, it doesn't mean the database for your application, because this opens it up to allow your application to talk to many different databases. So you could have, say, Postgres, maybe something else connects to MySQL for some reason, something like that. There's always that ability there. And then entities, it's an entity is a domain object that is defined by its identity. A little bit confusing, but basically it defines the structure of what you're used to working with and maps to the database column. So you think of it more of like your traditional model in a Ruby on Rails application. And a repository, basically the repository interfaces with that entity. So that's where you do all your queries. So you do, where you'd actually do like a find or create. So that's where you put that kind of logic. So the preface behind it essentially is that when you run through a repository, so you say they use an example of book, you can have a book repository that talks to the book entity, and that basically, when you create a book repository query, it will return a book entity, but that entity this is super important, is actually immutable. So you can't then, once you get a book back, do like book.save. It has to go through the repository, and this opens up to thinking how you model your data, how you make your queries as well, because you aren't putting all your queries actually on the entity, you're actually doing it all through the repository. So it just makes you think about your data and your persistence layer rather, and how that's structured and how that's built, and you generally get a much more efficient model architecture. So next up we have validations. Now this is a topic I'm not really going to cover. It does have validations. It can get rather complex. It's not as simple as Rails, but it's there, and it allows you to do basically anything and possibly more than Rails, in my opinion. Both have migration system, your standard stuff. It's all included there. Mailers, both have mailers. They basically operate the same. DSL's slightly different. It's not too different, but it's there. Both have asset management, fingerprinting, all that kind of stuff, all there, pretty much the same. CLI tool, so for actually generating controllers and things like that. They both have them. Hanami's one's pretty simple, pretty minimal. It doesn't give you as much out of the box as what you get from Rails, but it's enough to do the job and get you working a bit more efficient when using a CLI. Deployment is something you need to work out for yourself. There's a lot of different deployment methods for Rails. You can still use Capistrano with Hanami. There is actually a Capistrano Hanami gem that can help you with that, just like you have a Capistrano Rails gem. Background workers, there's nothing like active job in Hanami, so you'll have to integrate it yourself. So you'd just be doing it like you'd normally do, say Sidekick or something like that. So there's nothing new there. That's straightforward, just a little bit less integration that you have. It's just more manual yourself. Speed. Now Hanami is quick. It definitely is quicker. It feels a lot quicker. I'm hesitant to say that it definitely is 100% quicker, but from my testing and building applications and keeping it small with Hanami, it definitely feels a lot quicker, and the responses are a lot quicker. Tests run a lot quicker, and I'm not doing anything special. It's just standard stuff. So there seems to be something there. I'm leaving that verdict open because I want to get some more use with Hanami, especially in production. So I don't really want to comment on that, but it definitely feels a lot speedier. Documentation, that's the one thing that lacks with Hanami. Its documentation could be a lot better. Now, the documentation that's there is really good. I feel it could go in a little bit more depth, but there are sections that are missing. That's the main thing that I found issues with. Now, you can find them through RDoc, but it just means you've got to have a little bit more understanding of programming and how to look for these documentations or these sections. That's one of the only pain points where I've said in the past it's not quite beginner friendly. So that's one thing there. So my overall verdict, it's a fantastic framework. I love it. I really want to use it going on with projects going forward. Like just about everything that I do in Ruby, I want to go forward with Hanami. It's a really great lightweight framework. There's a bit more work to do to kind of get up and running and working with things, but it gives you a lot better results, and it slows you down and makes you think about what you're actually programming. If you have a mission critical application, stick with what you know. So you know Rails is tried and tested, you know where there's going to be issues or how to get around certain things. You don't really want to be starting a whole new project that's really, really important and then not know where the issues are or how to get around those issues. So I'd stick with Rails in that aspect or that kind of scenario. But if you are doing an application that's a bit safe, try Hanami out, push through any of the issues you might have with trying to find out how to do something or a certain way of doing it, because I think by the end of the project you'll really appreciate Hanami and the benefits it does give you. But that's essentially it. If you have any other questions, please leave them in the comment section below. I'd love to know your questions. And thank you to everyone who's asked me questions in the past at meetups about Hanami or actually on the YouTube channel about Hanami as well. Please keep them coming through. If you're enjoying this video, please click the like button and subscribe. Other than that, you can send through tweets to me at CoderCatchup on Twitter, send through an email to codercatchup@gmail.com. Also, you can check out the podcast that comes out every week at codercatchup.com. It's in iTunes and various other syndicated podcast services, so check that out. Other than that, we'll catch you the next one. Bye.